Welcome to the Back on Track podcast with me, Sam West. In every episode, I interview someone who's changed, recovered, or become successful after having faced real adversity in their life. What's more, at the end of every episode, guests give you a few bits of advice which you can use to improve your own life too. On today's episode is Josephine Bridges, who was diagnosed with terminal bone cancer at the age of just 17. Miraculously, after exploring different treatment options, Josephine managed to overcome the cancer, but still had to endure bone recovery surgeries on her leg every 2 years. After 11 years of being in and out of hospital with these surgeries, Josephine finally decided to opt for the amputation. However, what followed was a gruelling period trying to adjust to life as an amputee, as Josephine really struggled with phantom pain and mental illness. As a result of her struggles, Josephine decided to start the charity Positive Bones, which aims to empower people with limb difference to live a life without limits. So, without further ado, let's find out what happened by listening to her story from start to finish. Josephine, first of all, I just want to say a massive thank you for taking the time to come on the podcast. I really appreciate you giving us some of your time this evening. How are you doing? How's everything going?
Good, thank you. Yeah, everything's going really well. I've been ploughing along recently with work and then applications in the evening, but we're getting to a really good point now, so I can feel myself slowly easing off in the pressure and feeling a bit more relaxed, which is great.
Absolutely. How do you find managing your job as a teacher and also the charity sort of side by side? You must be really busy.
It is really busy, yeah. I mean, when I started Positive Bones, I knew that this was going to be a dual thing. So and I was already doing that a lot with the Instagram page before it became a charity. So I suppose I was practiced or versed in kind of like that dual-mindedness. And so coming on lunch breaks and going, okay, I need to do a post or I need to do something or respond to a message. And so when it became a charity, it was actually the admin of charity that added to that. But it's something that I already knew how to manage in that time. So, doing it on weekends, doing it on a Saturday or a Sunday, doing it in the evenings. And it's, to a degree, Positive Bones is a hobby. It's something that I'm really passionate about. So it makes it much easier to do in the evenings. And I really enjoy my job as a lecturer as well. That's also a hobby. So I don't really feel like I'm working ever.
Well, that's fantastic to have two things which are both your passion. I think that's a position that sort of all of us dream and hope to be in. But Josephine, yeah, I always like to go back to the start of a guest story so that listeners can really grasp it from start to finish. And you certainly have an incredible story, and I think it's one of just sheer resilience. And I think we can all find a lot of inspiration from it. I really do. So rewinding back to the age of 17, you were diagnosed with Osteosarcoma, I believe, which is, for those who don't know, is bone cancer. And to make sort of matters worse, as if that wasn't bad enough, you were also told that it was terminal. I mean, I can't imagine how difficult that must have been to process at the age of 17. But could you tell us a bit about the events that led up to your diagnosis and also how you felt when that news, when you were told that news?
So in the lead up to my diagnosis, so it's a strange story. I burnt my leg and I started limping, and I was limping maybe for around about 3 months, and then I just continued limping. And we started to notice a lump growing on my leg, and I kept going back to the GP. Osteosarcoma is really rare. It's particularly rare in teenagers. But it's rare in general. And so when I had this lump on my leg and I kept going back to the GP, they kept saying it's growing pains or it's something wrong with your muscle. And actually they were encouraging things like massage and exercise, but it was agony, sheer agony, and it eventually got worse and worse and worse, and to the point where I could barely walk. I was really, really struggling. And I went to go for a scan. I've got bad kidneys. I've had bad kidneys all my life, and I went to go for a scan on my kidneys that involves injecting some radioactive dye, which is always pretty cool. And they basically see how it's all flushing through your body. And while I was there, my dad, who's got kind of Jedi powers, basically persuaded the nurse to scan my leg. He was like, "Look, whatever you do, just please scan it." And she did, and naturally then alarm bells started ringing off. And they kind of, I went for a couple more scans and they sent me home. And that night, my mum had a call from actually what turned out eventually to be my oncologist, saying, Josephine's got hot spots in her leg and we'd like her to come in for some urgent review. And my mum's a nurse. They obviously didn't know that. she knew immediately that hotspots often signified cancer, and so she was, asking them questions as naturally you would as a mother. And I heard the conversation, I overheard it. And she sat me down at the kitchen table. I remember it really vividly. And she said, Jose, you've got hotspots in your leg. And me being quite stubborn said, right, okay, well, what are hotspots? And she said, well, I don't know, but they're going to find out in a scan. And I said, well, you do know, and I would like to know. Well, it could be cancer. And to be honest, it's hard to describe. One, I knew by that point I was really quite ill. The fact that I was really struggling to walk and I had this lump on my leg, although I'd never even heard of bone cancer, I didn't even think it was a thing. I just knew that something quite drastic was happening. And two, there was a sense in me that by the time we were having that conversation and she'd said hotspots, I kind of thought, well, okay, it's cancer. And so I was quite prepared, and I went, okay, right, that's what we think it is, right, let's, what's the next steps, etc., and went through the next process. And she said, look, you don't have to go to college tomorrow. And again, I am really stubborn and extremely determined. And I also had a boyfriend at the time, and I'm 17, I've got a boyfriend. Obviously that's like my number one thing in the world at that moment in my life.
Absolutely.
And so I said, well, I'm going to go to college because I want to see my boyfriend. And I went. The next day I went to college, and as I stepped off the bus, as I arrived at college, my leg just broke under my weight. And it wasn't painful. It obviously was extremely traumatic. But it just crumbled like chalk, like cream cheese. There wasn't really pain. It was just kind of, extremely, uncomfortable. And naturally they called the ambulance, etc. And I remember saying to somebody at the time who was with me and checking up on me and going, they think I've got cancer in my leg. And she's going, no, it's like, you don't need to be that dramatic. Like, it's fine. You've just broken your leg, or you probably just sprained it. And I was like, no, they genuinely think I've got cancer in my leg.
I really do.
And,
yes.
And I was having this conversation, and then the ambulance came, and I told them, and they were like, no, you don't, it's fine. Calm down, take a breather. And they're taking off my boots, and they're taking off my jeans, and my legs moving around. And I went for an X-ray and everything like that. So I found out truly that I had cancer from very dramatic beginnings, and two ambulance drivers coming around the corner and going, we're really sorry that we didn't believe you, and me going, no, it's fine. It's kind of, I knew it. But I was I was very calm about it, because I think I have at that point in my life, I don't know, I think I just thought, well, there's nothing I can do really, and being upset or crying about it, yes, is very cathartic and necessary. But actually, for me at the time, I didn't feel as though it was going to be something that was going to really help me. And I'm a very practical person. So I think I just thought, well, I've just got to do what happens next. What's the next thing? What's the next thing I can do? And how do I move forward? And I was more concerned about my family, because I saw my dad cry for the first time in my entire life, and things like that. I was more worried about the effect on them. And we're like that as a family unit anyway. We're all kind of worried about each other. So I think the worry that I might have expressed internally, actually, I expressed externally by wanting to look after them.
Yeah, I think it's incredible that at such a young age you took that sort of attitude and approach to dealing with it. I don't think I would have been able to deal with it that well at the age of 17 or at the age of 26 as I am now, to be totally honest. But so you had this sort of quite shocking moment where your leg effectively shattered from beneath you, and you had to have surgery, is that right? And you had to have metal put in your leg and learn how to walk again. That all sounds very sort of traumatic in itself, really, sort of never mind the cancer as well. Could you talk us through that process of them effectively putting your leg back together and learning to walk again and all the rest of it?
Absolutely. Well, because I was terminal, what they thought was terminal, I'm obviously here today, so clearly not. Because of that, first of all, my oncologist was like, well, there's nothing we can really do apart from put you on palliative treatment. And I said, well, you're wrong, I'm going to survive. Sheer, like I say, purely driven. And I just believed, I was 17, so first of all, at that age, you believe you're invincible anyway. But I just knew that I was going to be okay. I had this complete and utter innocence that I was going to be okay. And so I said, you've got to do something. And so they put me on a trial treatment for chemotherapy. And so I was in hospital for pretty much a year, with the odd week or the odd weekend out here and there. And they also initially wanted to amputate my leg. And at the time I said, you couldn't possibly do that. Funnily enough, I was okay with being diagnosed with cancer, but the idea at the time of becoming amputee absolutely devastated me. And I was crying, and you can't do that to me, and there must be another way, and I'm going to live. And, naturally, the surgery that I had costs a lot of money. The surgery to take out the cancerous bone and replace it with metal costs a lot of money. And to be morose, you're not going to spend that much money on someone who's not going to be able to use it because they're not going to be here.
Wow.
And so amputation is the kind of more effective. It's the more effective option in regards to treating the cancer and kind of like keeping it at bay. But it's also the more effective option cost-wise, which I know is not something that we typically discuss, but it is part of it's still part of the healthcare process. And so but I managed to find a surgeon who believed me, or who I suppose. I don't think believe me is the right word, but gave me a chance and said, okay, we won't do the amputation, we will do the recovery surgery. So leg recovery surgery involves removing all of the cancerous bone and replacing it with metal prostheses. So I had a metal tibia and a metal knee. So effectively like a knee replacement, but very long. And it was great for around about 2 years. But unfortunately, so the way it works is there's a pin, and it effectively sits inside the remaining bone. And down in my tibia, because there was so little bone left, and because it was so damaged from cancer and chemotherapy and so on, after 2 years, it just basically started to crumble and fracture. And so I had to have the metal bone taken out and replaced, and learn how to walk again. And each time they're cutting off a bit of bone, but they're also having to move all your muscles around, or potentially remove muscle. And so each time it involves like a full reconstruction.
After the first operation where they put the metal in and took some of the cancerous bone out, and after the chemotherapy, was that then the end of the cancer, so to speak? Were you in remission then? If we could just talk a bit about that.
Yeah, so I was in remission from bone cancer. Unfortunately, it wasn't my last soiree with cancer.
Right.
I later on in my life, I ended up having a precancerous breast lump and a malignant skin cancer. Like a mole that they removed effectively. I don't know whether they're correlated. I have had genetic testing and things like that, but so following for the bone cancer itself, that was the end of it. That was the end of my chemotherapy. But in truth, because I kept having to go back for surgery, it never really did feel like the end of cancer for me. And now, later on in life, it still doesn't feel like it. It feels very much like, although I don't have cancer anymore, I still feel very much like cancer is something I live with every day.
Because of the after effects of it, yeah. But the thing is, so you were diagnosed with terminal cancer, and so of course, you've sort of talked about the after effects. But was there a moment of happiness at the fact that finally it wasn't going to be terminal, that you were going to survive, or did you not have that sort of moment of, at least I can not think about dying effectively?
Yeah, that's true. So yes, you have 5 years. So 5 years post chemo, where and that if at the end of that 5 years you're indicated as being clear of cancer, and it's very, very unlikely to come back. You never, with something like bone cancer, because naturally your bone produces bone marrow and blood, it means that to a degree there's always going to be some floating bone cancer cells swimming around my body, but my chances are so minimal. So they never say you're completely clear of it, but they do say that you're we don't have to see you anymore, you don't have to come to any more check-up appointments or anything like that. So after 5 years, I had what I called my cancerversary, and that was like, okay, that's the end of cancer now, most likely for me going forward into the future. I celebrated with a wine and cheese night, which is very grown up for my age. I think by that point I was 23 or something like that. So no, 22.
That does sound very, very grown up. But the thing about this, Josephine, is that you told me a very sad fact before we did the interview, and that was that you attended 11 funerals during your time on the teenage cancer ward, and you were only one of 3 people that survived. And I can't imagine how difficult that must have been to process at the age of 17, 11 people passing away around you. And it must have felt obviously extremely close to home, because, you were going through a very similar thing. And I'm just wondering how tough that was for you.
Yeah, it was. It was obviously incredibly hard. I mean, because I was in the hospital all the time. you get to know people naturally. And because you're in a teenage cancer ward in particular, teenagers kind of operate slightly differently. And there was things like, because I was on a TCT ward, which is a charity, they, I there was like a breakout room where you could play on PlayStation and you could go on computers and watch TV, and they had pizza nights and stuff like that. So you did genuinely get to know all the people around you. And your parents did as well, because they are with you. Parents can sleep on a TCT ward, so they were with me 24/7, and they're with all the other parents as well. Everyone gets to know each other. It's like some weird, morbid sleepover.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, I was out of. There was 14 of us on the ward, or 14 people that were in my regular cycle, and 11 didn't make it through for various reasons or other. And yeah, it's the hard part. The hardest part I found from it was going to these funerals, and you've known these people only as cancer patients. So I've only sat with them as cancer patients and known them in that format. And in some cases, that means that they've been extremely ill and unable to be themselves in their truest sense. I've never been for a drink with them or out on a night out, or I've never, swapped secrets about boyfriends or anything like that. And so when you go to these funerals and you hear their friends and family all talking about them and talking about them in a way that you didn't know them, you suddenly realize that there's this whole life that they had outside of cancer, and that there are so many things that they would have had, hopes and dreams and aims and goals. And it does in some ways imply guilt upon you for being a survivor or still being there. But I always thought about that in another way. And I felt like when I was at these funerals, and I still feel this now, is that, well, I'm still here. And so I have to live, and I have to do all of these wonderful things. And I have to make the most of the time that I am here for those that couldn't be. I have to be here and be present, and, make the most out of my life, because they would have loved the chance to have more life, and they would have loved the chance to be here and to hug their family one more time and all of those. So for me, it's that I didn't really take on the guilt aspect of it, but rather that I felt as though I had almost a responsibility in a positive way, not a negative way. And I think that's something that, when you're faced with your own mortality, especially at such a young age, it's both a curse and a privilege in that sense. And the privilege is most certainly that you kind of go, well, this is so valuable.
Well, I think your ability to sort of process these things is just incredible. We talked earlier about sort of processing the diagnosis at 17, and also processing all those people sadly not making it around you. And I think you just have an incredible ability to be able to deal with these things. And certainly it shows with what you're trying to do right now with the charity and helping other people and giving back. You certainly are doing that. So Josephine, going back to sort of where you were a minute ago before we rewound a bit. So you had the metal put in your leg, and some people might think, oh great, that's the end of that, but that really wasn't the case. And there was a period of 11 years where every 2 years you'd have to go back in and have surgery and have the metal replaced, because effectively the leg would keep failing. And I mean, to me, that is just the definition of adversity, really, to have to go through something as tough as that every couple of years for a duration of 11 years. I mean, I don't know how you sort of managed to keep going with it and stay strong. Could you tell us a bit about how difficult that was for you, and also how you coped with that?
Yeah, so I think actually the first 5 years of going in and out of surgery and so on were easier, because I was still in that zone of I don't even know whether I'm going to make it through this 5 years. So there was still very much of, okay, fine, it's another surgery, but I'm going to go and do this and do that. And I was constantly reaching for exciting moments in my life, and kind of ticking off bucket lists to a degree. But once I left that realm, and certainly once I kind of started into the university process, I felt the thing I found hardest was that it kept putting a pause on my life, because when you're going, first of all, you have to go and, you're going in for surgery, and it requires a certain amount of time to recover. And then you're learning to walk again. And so, every time I was going for surgery, I was having to put a halt on my life and my friendships and, my opportunities and my progression, to go and have everything restored again and have it all rebuilt. And that was something that grew increasingly frustrating as I grew up, effectively, because then suddenly it's jobs, and and then it's thinking about buying houses, and then it's future, and it's getting married, and all of those plans. And you get to a point where you think, well, how much longer can I do this for? The next, how many times am I really going to end up having this surgery? And you start thinking about your future going forward and all the years you have to hopefully come. And you think to yourself, well, when am I going to stop this? Or is this always going to be part of my life? Am I just going to have to schedule it in? And so, but I think the way I got through it is by constantly having things and aims that I wanted to go towards. So it was like, okay, yeah, fine, I've got to take 6 months or 3 months out of my life. That's fine. I'll do that. But I know that at the end of this is what I'm going to be doing next. And so I was constantly trying out new things, and I never really let it stop me. I still went to university and got married, bought my first house, got my first job, and I went, and I learned how to handy ski, which is skiing in a sit ski, so it's a seat on skis, effectively. And I went on some incredible trips, and I travelled, but also my family and my friends were always around me and always kind of keeping me going. Whenever I did have surgery, I knew that they were always going to be by my side. So it wasn't like I was taking everything out of my life and having to take a pause on everything, because I knew they were always going to be there. And I've been really lucky to be surrounded by some incredible people in that sense, that have never stopped being my number one supporters. And in reality, throughout all of this, that's what's got me through all of it, is friends and family, because they are the glue that holds it all together, really. And without them, I wouldn't be, I realize that obviously what I'm saying can sometimes seem like it's all just me and I've just had this attitude, but actually that attitude comes from the love that I am surrounded with, because they have absolute faith that I'm always going to make it through, and that always means that I have absolute faith that I'm going to make it through. So it's a joint effort.
Yeah, absolutely, for sure. But, I think we certainly shouldn't underplay your personal resilience. Honestly, everything that you'd had to go through, from, the diagnosis to having, your leg replaced effectively every 2 years over the period of 11 years, your life stopping and starting. You can have all of the support in the world, but ultimately you do need to have that sort of fight inside you as well, which clearly you did have. But so it got to the point after 11 years where you just thought, enough was enough. It was putting too many stops on your life, and this is when you started to entertain the idea of opting for the amputation. Now, although what you'd had to go through was hell with doing this sort of replacement effectively every 2 years, that still can't have been an easy decision, because you spoke earlier about when the idea of an amputation was mentioned when you were younger, sort of the age of 17, you were thinking, you can't do this to me, et cetera, et cetera. So it can't have been an easy thing, although it was sort of hell what you'd had to go through, or maybe not. Perhaps that's wrong. Perhaps you had reached such a point where it made so much sense. Could you talk to us a bit about your thought process when you eventually opted for the amputation?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's ironic because of exactly that. When I was 17, I was saying, please don't amputate. And then all the way through the 11 years, I was constantly being extremely careful with my leg in case I fell and it broke and I'd end up with an amputation, to only end up coming to the decision myself. It was hard. Yes, it was hard to make the decision, but only in the sense of assessing my capabilities. Again, I'm quite practical. So it was about what's going to get me the most out of my body, what's going to allow me to do the most and to achieve the things that I'm hoping to achieve and things like that. So it was a way up of capabilities. And so I looked at what I'd be able to do with, if they replaced it, I had these kind of example scenarios. So if they once again rebuilt my leg, and say, for example, this time it was absolutely perfect and my leg, continue, and I went on for the next 25 years without any more needs for surgery. What would I be capable of? What would be possible for me? And then, the converse, which is that they rebuild it again, and that it does heal again in 2 years' time. Where am I going to be in 2 years' time? And then finally, if I had it amputated. And so I did a lot of research. I mean, me, my husband, my family, we all conducted a lot of research into what it's like to be an amputee, prosthetics available, the whole realm of amputation, and even what the surgery was like. What is that going to be like? How long am I going to be taking a pause on my life, etc. And so when we weighed all this up and looked at it in a very kind of black and white pros and cons list, amputation was the thing that made the most sense, providing I was able to access certain prosthetics. So that was the linchpin for it, that kind of said, okay, amputation is going to be possible, but only if we're able to purchase some very nice private prosthetics. So it actually wasn't as hard. It wasn't a hard emotional decision, because I think then by that point I was so fed up with constantly having to say no to things or constantly having to hold myself back, that it was just, well, what is going to be the best decision for me to be able to have to hold back less, or hold back the least, I suppose.
And also, little did you know at the time, but this was effectively going to be the birth of Positive Bones, because as you say, you were looking at, other legs that you could get privately, and you found they were quite expensive. I think you mentioned to me even up to £100,000, which is not the kind of money that most people just have lying around to spend on something. So obviously you knew that you had to fundraise, and so you started fundraising, and in the end you decided to go for a leg, I believe, that was sort of more in the region of 50,000. And then you were going to use the other part of the money to start the charity. I think I'm right in saying that. Yeah, could you talk to us a bit about your decision to fundraise and how things went from there?
Well, actually, I didn't. So I made this decision that I was going to have the amputation. I needed to buy this private prosthesis, and as part of my research, I looked at loads, and I found this absolutely incredible one online, and it was a video of an ex-army serviceman who was actually able to return to the army through the use of this leg, and he was running and jumping and skiing and swimming and everything. And I thought, right, that's the leg for me. And I went to the process of going to this private clinic and talking to them about it, seeing what its capabilities were, etc. And I thought to myself initially, well, I'll just have to sell my house. I'll sell the house, I'll get a loan, I'll do that. And it was my friends and family that said, well, why don't you fundraise for it? And the idea at that time for me was I really, the guilt I had of the idea of asking people for money for me to get a leg I was like, I can't do that. It really felt like something that was so alien to me. And I suppose it's because I felt as though I was asking for something that was more than what was available on the NHS. So there was this kind of yes, okay, I could have an NHS leg, but NHS is wonderful and great, but they don't get the support and the funding that they need, especially within the amputee services. And so the only legs that they can really offer are kind of legs that just do straight up walking. And I wanted something more than that. I'm a climber and a skier and a kayaker and a hiker, and and I also wanted, I enjoy anything outdoors, and so I wanted to be able to say yes to everything really. And so I wanted a leg that gave me that capability, but I felt this guilt that I was asking for more than what was available to me. And it was my family and friends that kind of very saliently pointed out to me, I didn't ask to have cancer, and I didn't ask to be in this position of making a decision about to become an amputee. And so so it was, they were saying, and if people want to donate, they will, it's up to them. And so I decided to set up Positive Bones, which initially started as a fundraiser for me, and something that I found certainly when I was looking to become an amputee and doing my research was that there are lots of wonderful amputees online who are Paralympians or who are doing these incredible things. But I wanted information about what it was like day to day. What's the standard stuff? How do you go to the toilet in the night? What's it like on a day where you can't wear your leg? How do you cook in the kitchen, etc., etc. And so I set out to set up Positive Bones as a fundraiser, but also as an information service for other people who might be out there looking for that. So it was a very light touch fundraiser. I really didn't want to ask for money very often. And so it was more of a, if you can donate, that would be great. But here is some wonderful information and resource that you might find useful. And I took people through my journey as well, because I think sometimes that's something we don't often get to see, is the nitty gritty of recovery. We see the kind of the before and the after, and oh great, I'm recovered now, but actually there's a really long and painful and difficult process that happens in between that's got lots of ups and downs. And Instagram is a great tool for accessing information, but sometimes it's very glossed over. And so actually to be able to show people the true storyline and what it truly is like to recover felt really important to me. So I set up Positive Bones in that format, really, to tell my story. And fundraising the process.
Yeah, no, and it's fantastic that you set up Positive Bones, and we'll get into what the charity is set up to do in more detail in a second. But before we do, and you touched on it there yourself, and I felt it was a really important part of this podcast, and that was that we should talk about the process of sort of adjustment, if you like, but after you became an amputee, because as you rightly say, it's not as simple as I raise the money for the leg, have the amputee, and crack on with life. Exactly, on we go. It's certainly not as easy as that. And we spoke on the phone before the podcast, and you mentioned to me, for example, the phantom pain that you had was terrible, and this actually resulted in you becoming depressed and even becoming suicidal at some point. So there's a real there's a tale of adversity in itself in just the process of adjusting after becoming an amputee. And you're right, we definitely shouldn't gloss over that. And so could you just talk us through in your own words how that process was for you?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I'd had all my previous surgeries, I'd always had the surgery and kind of recovered very quickly, bounced back, and didn't really suffer with pain, didn't have to have too many painkillers. And so when I went into amputation, I had this expectation that I was going to be exactly the same. I was going to have the amputation and I was going to bounce back. I'd be running and walking and doing everything within so many months. And it wasn't the case. And when I came out of surgery, I suffered really badly with phantom pain. I still do now. So I have phantom pain is rare in itself. It doesn't happen to that many amputees. And the type of phantom pain I had is even rarer. So there's only something like 10% of amputees who get phantom pain. And I had the 1% type of phantom pain out of that 10%. So I'm not very good at maths, so I can't work out those ratios, but it was a very, very minimal chance where I had it 24/7, and I had the full spectrum of phantom pain. So burning, stinging, cutting, chopping, everything like that. I felt it all in my phantom limb. So for anybody that doesn't know what phantom pain is pain in the limb that is now removed. So it doesn't exist. So there's nothing you can do to alleviate it. Painkillers aren't going to do anything. You can't massage it, you can't rub it, because the space doesn't exist. It's a trick of the mind, where the mind is basically searching desperately for the limb that's been removed.
Right.
And in the process is sending all of these brain signals down and going alert, 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 and constantly warning you. And that creates pain, because that's ultimately what pain is. It's an alert to tell you to look at something or check something out. It was unbearable. And at first I was fine. I was managing it in my true way, and kind of going, it's okay, it'll get better and get better. But after 6 months with constant 24/7 pain, barely any sleep, I just slowly went down into a very, very dark pit. And it came about in a multitude of ways. One, I felt as though I'd failed at being me. I felt as though I'd failed at being Positive Bones, Positive Jose. I'd had this story and this narrative of I'm always very, kind of keeping it very practical and very upbeat and very stoic. And actually, I felt as though I'd failed at that because I hadn't been able to recover and bounce back, and that I was having these kind of like very negative thoughts. But also the pain was so unbearable. I genuinely couldn't imagine my life going forward in that much pain. Like, I couldn't envisage having children or going back to work or doing all of those things whilst being in that much pain. And so I went through this. As it slowly got worse, things started to add on top of it as well. So, for example, I ended up quitting my job because I found the stress of it too much. There's lots of triggers for phantom pain, and one of my triggers is stress. And so the stress of work ended up triggering that, and meaning that I ended up getting more phantom pain. And I ended up in one of the darkest places I've ever been in my entire life. And I've had dark periods when I had cancer naturally, but this is the darkest I've ever felt. And I ended up being suicidal purely for the fact that I was thinking, I just can't do this. I am really using all of my strength here, and I just can't do this. I can't be in this much pain all the time. It's absolutely impossible to live life, and it's stopping me. All the things I had my amputation for, I wasn't able to do because I was in so much pain. So it felt like I'd really thrown myself off a cliff, to be honest, and it made me feel like I wanted to throw myself off a cliff, which was horrible. It's horrible. You feel like you've constantly got away with you. A very, very dark dog, as they call it, a very black dog that sat with me all the time and weighed upon everything I did.
Wow, I can't imagine how tough that must have been, and especially probably as some of it came as a bit of a surprise as well. I remember you said to me before that sort of the doctors didn't talk that much about the pain before the amputation, so I can imagine that probably made it worse. So what got you out of that dark hole, Josephine? Thankfully we're still here talking today. You're here to share your story, and it's an amazing one. But what got you out of that hole that you're in? Because obviously it sounds terrible at that moment in time.
It was, and actually I was really good at covering it up. I think a lot of people who have experienced depression or suicide can share this sentiment that you get very good at pretending you're not feeling horrendous all the time, or hiding away. And so actually, no, I really wasn't talking about it, and it was by fluke that I went to go and see my surgeon. And I think in my desperation, he saw that I needed something more. So first of all, he referred me to a pain clinician. Now, I had tried everything for pain. I mean, I tried every single tablet under the sun. I tried every single wacky therapy. I even wrapped my leg up in foil because it's supposed to help with the electromagnetic waves. It looked like a piece of ham.
Wow.
I did everything under the sun, aromatherapy and acupuncture and all sorts. And I found that nothing was really helping. And so, he recommended, and he referred me to a therapist, and he knows I'm strong-minded. And so he was like, look, she's not your standard therapist. First of all, she specializes in pain. So she's a pain therapist. And so she can talk to you particularly about what pain is and help you understand it. But also on top of that, she's a nice lady, and she's just go there with an open mind. He knows me really well, my surgeon. He's done my surgeries for however many years, so we've got a very good back and forth relationship. So he was a bit like, you're just going to have to do it and suck it up and go to this therapist.
Trust me, yeah.
And I did, and she was wonderful. And by this point I was working out painkillers and things like that, but she opened my eyes. She first of all educated me to what pain is, and that is really useful when you're discussing phantom pain, because it helps you put it into context. Once you understand that actually a lot of this is a mental thing, is that it's your brain telling you that there's something wrong, you need to check it out, you can then start actually speaking to your brain in a bizarre way and say, actually, do you know what, it's fine, I chose to have this amputation. And I have had an amputation, and you can kind of really address it physically and say, okay, look, there's no leg there, and have those kind of internal conversations. But also she helped me discuss pain in a way that wasn't painful. When you're talking about pain, naturally your brain then it creates these connections, etc., and so it can start to trigger that. So we started naming things. We started naming pain phantom Phil, and my leg is I've got Kev the leg, which is my prosthetic, I've got Tim the residual limb, which is my stump, and I've got phantom Phil, and we discussed them in conversation. And we addressed Phil like he was it was about turning Phil, taking him from an enemy to being a friend, and kind of saying, okay, so Phil is going to be here. Phil will probably be here for the rest of my life. There's nothing I can do about phantom Phil. He's part of my existence. But just because he's here, just because he's sat at the table with me, doesn't mean I have to interact with him, or doesn't mean that he has to take over the conversation. And it was about kind of creating these, I suppose, characters that then I could apply boxes to, or apply parameters to. So like I say, if I was having dinner with friends, often phantom pain would trigger in, and I'd really struggle to concentrate. I'd struggle to have a nice time with my friends. It would start to then play on my mind. I'd get stressed about being in pain. I'd start to feel as though I was ruining everyone's night because I couldn't engage with them, etc. But when we started talking about it as being Phantom Phil the friend, it was like, okay, I can say to my friends, Phantom Phil's here. I'm sorry, I'm a bit quiet. And we all know that it's here. Phil's in the room, Phil's sat at the table, but we don't have to engage with it. We don't have to bring it into conversation. And the other thing as well that she did, which was really interesting, is by this point, by the time I was seeing her, pain wasn't just something I was experiencing physically, but it was having obviously an effect on me mentally. So I was experiencing it mentally. And when you have that kind of pain where it's taking over your life and it's causing a lot of stress, it's very natural then for you to start almost over-egging the pudding in your mind. So you can feel the pain coming on, and so naturally your stress comes up and you start thinking, oh my god, I'm going to be in pain, and you start almost imagining how much pain you're going to be in and all of that. I'm not going to sleep, or I'm not going to be able to do this, I'm not going to be able to enjoy myself. And so she asked me to really focus in on the pain, like really focus on it, which is incredibly hard to do. Imagine being stabbed and then being told to really focus on the wound and the pain.
It's the last thing you want to do. Yeah.
It was, and it required a lot of preparation, and we did some breathing exercises and things like that. And I really learned to focus in on the pain. And what was really interesting is that when I really did focus in, I found that actually the pain was far better than I was imagining it. In my mind, it was so much stronger and heavier because I'd begun associating it with all of these negative things, because it's various sensations. Phantom pain kind of, there's burning, and there's stabbing, and there's electric shock and stuff like that. When you really start focusing in on it, sometimes the pain was actually quite interesting and quite intriguing. So it was also about approaching it with a bit of curiosity to go, oh, what does that feel like? Oh, that's a bit unusual. And that, all of that in a package of kind of actually just talking about it, learning how to breathe, learning how to stay relaxed, learning how to deal with stress better in my life, it's a whole package. And then painkillers, and kind of learning what my triggers were as well, what triggered the pain, things like cold, etc. Ended up meaning that the pain slowly alleviated. But by that point, my mental health had taken such a deep dive. Actually, the therapy was the better part of it that came out of it was the fact that I started to just feel better. And it was just about addressing the fact that I hadn't failed, and that it was okay, and that it was okay that I hadn't just sprung up to the other side of amputation, and that this is all very normal, and that recovery is this long process, and to forgive myself and to have compassion and empathy towards my journey, and to treat myself like I would a friend or a family member. If they said to me, I'm really struggling because of XYZ, what would I say to them? Well, I'd go, well, of course you haven't been and failed. And of course, you're doing a brilliant job, and you've just had an amputation, for goodness sake. Those are all the things you'd be saying, but it's not the things you often say to yourself. So she, along with the support of family and friends, because by this point I had told them and we had those difficult conversations, meant that I started to really see the light at the end of it. And I'll always have in that dark hole in me, there'll always be that pit, and there'll always be that openness. Once you've thought about something like suicide once, it tends to then live with you in some manner. And once you've looked down into the abyss, you can't look out of it. So it'll always exist with me, but that's not to say that it is now a heavily strong part of me. It's just something that's there, and I recognize it as part of my life, and I've grown from it and learned from it. And so there's a positive to it as well to be taken from it. It's taught me so much about myself. And about that compassion, really.
Absolutely. No, I think to be totally honest there, so before starting this podcast some 6 months ago, whatever it was, and I was coming up with the narrative for the podcast, and I thought, so people are going to go through these really tough things, and then they're going to come out the other side, absolutely brand new, perfect, got over it fully, and all the rest of it. And what I've learned through doing this podcast is that actually more often than not, it's not that people totally eradicate these demons from their lives. They're still there to some extent, but it's about learning to manage them. And it doesn't mean that you can't live a happy and prosperous life with them being sort of slightly in the picture. It's just not giving them center stage, so to speak.
Yeah.
And that certainly seems true for you to a certain extent.
Yeah.
You recognize that phantom pain is something that you'll live with, but you've gone through such a sort of a deep and detailed learning process with regards to how to deal with it. And I think it's so interesting that, giving it a personality and also focusing directly on it. I mean, because it sounds crazy, as you said, imagine you've been stabbed and then asked to sort of focus on how it feels. It seems sort of backwards, but incredible that that it works and that it's helped you. And also now, Positive Bones makes so much sense to me logically now, because you had to learn so much in the moment, and it would have been really useful for you, I think, if Positive Bones had existed before you'd had your amputation, so that you could have had all of this information and it wouldn't have been so much of a surprise for you. So it's really clear to me sort of the need for Positive Bones, and that's what we're going to chat about now. Get into some positivity and talk about the amazing work that the charity is sort of aiming to do. So I think I'm right in saying, did you become a charity? Was it in September of last year?
It was in September of last year, yeah.
In September of last year, and that you're gonna.
Sorry, I forgot what year it was. I forgot we'd already been through New Year. I think COVID has made all the time blur into one. So.
Yeah, honestly, I barely know what day it is at this stage. It's Groundhog Day every day. But anyway, that's a story for another day. So you became an official charity in September, and anyone that set up a charity, my mum set up one, so I have a vague idea of sort of the process, and it's a very long process, and there's lots of official paperwork and requirements and stuff. That's a story in itself. But so you set up the charity, and I think I'm right in saying that you're hoping to sort of be open for grant applications later this year, which is really exciting stuff. But for the listeners that have no idea what Positive Bones is, what it aims to do, could you give us a rundown of the stuff that you're hoping to provide and achieve with the charity?
Yeah, so something to just briefly clarify on earlier. So when I fundraised for my own leg, I initially fundraised for £100,000, with the idea being that I calculated out based on sockets and liners and physiotherapy and the leg itself how much I would need, and I knew I'd need roughly around about £100,000. But actually, when it came down to buying my leg, I had by that point tested out so many different ones that the one I went for was much cheaper than the one I was initially aiming for, which was great because it meant that when we started Positive Bones, the charity, we had a pocket. And I always said that anything excess, and from the very beginning, I kind of had this goal that at the end of this, I'd probably be doing something to help other people. I didn't necessarily think it was going to be an official charity, but I knew it was going to be something that would be giving back to the community of amputees and limb disability. And so I always knew that anything excess was going to go into that pot. And so it was great when actually I could go for the cheaper leg and have an even bigger pot to be able to hand out to people, which was great. So Positive Bones is a limb disability charity, and we aim to provide support, guidance, advice, and funding to people with limb difference. And the idea is that so often we think of things like sports, for example. We think somebody's, they're disabled or they have a limb disability and they're going to want to be a Paralympian, so they're going to go and want to do some sports. There's loads of wonderful sports-related charities out there that provide that specialist equipment, but there isn't really a charity that just provides the kind of standard stuff. What about if someone has had to have their hand amputated but really enjoys gardening and just wants a specialist adaptation that means that they can have hold a trowel, or that they can have a trowel for a hand, and that's the scale of it. So at some ends, it's going to be something that's actually we'll be funding things that are quite small, or things that actually, they're not these big, fancy specialist pieces of equipment. But on the other end of it, we are funding that. So Positive Bones is a grant charity. So people will apply for funding for a specialist piece of equipment. So that could be, like I say, for example, a trowel for a hand. All the services, so that can be specialist physio or intensive physio that lasts like a week, all the way through to prosthetics, so full limbs or hands or knee joints, feet, sockets, etc. So it's the full spectrum, and people can apply for any of those things. And the only stipulation is that they have to be things that aren't available on the NHS, because naturally, if they're available on the NHS, then it doesn't make sense for us to be a charity for that. But it's for anybody really. It has no framework surrounding it. We're not saying that you have to be sporty, or we're not saying that you have to be a certain age, or we're not saying that you have to have done a certain thing in your life or anything like that. There's no connection to any of that. It's just, do you want to do a bit more than what's available to you, or do you want something that provides you the opportunity to do more than what's available to you? And it came about in my mind because I sat a lot of the time in rehab centres, naturally as part of my own rehab, and I saw so many people that weren't being given the opportunity. Again, not because of the NHS, the NHS workers' fault. They're all doing a fantastic job, but because of the funding and the support they receive, they aren't able to give that extra bit to people who might need it. And the number one reason for amputation in the UK is diabetes. So naturally, by the time that you're having your leg amputated for diabetes, you're already at a certain point in your life, and there's this wrong perception that then you're not really going to want to do very much, or that you're not going to be very active, or that you're not going to be very motivated, which is completely wrong. And I saw this happen time and time again. I sat with people who were giving it their all and were really trying, and only to end up with something that they didn't feel as though was fully functional for them or fully serviceable for them. And actually that can really demotivate you. That process can be really, and the fact that it takes so long can be really demotivating. And it means that that person then is probably not going to recover as fast as they would have liked to, or they're not going to be as motivated to try new things. And so Positive Bones is about giving people that motivation and that empowerment to say, you can try it and you can do it. And it could be something wholly new. It can be something you enjoyed before. It can even be that you just want to get back to work and you need something to help you get back to work. Whatever it is that kind of brings that positivity to your life, we're totally there to try and support you and get you that. And even if it's not a piece of equipment, even if it is just the guidance through the website and through the social media, that's okay. And that's exactly what we're there for. We're there for that empowerment and for that support and that motivation to try and drive people through things. Because I think once you try something once you learn how to do something one time, or once you rediscover something one time, and then opens up this whole world of possibilities that you go, what else could I try? And it's the same when you see it on social media. So on our Instagram page, we share stories of other amputees and so on. I think sometimes you can see that story and you can go, oh wow, well they've just done that, like I wonder if I could do that. And that's exactly what it's about. It's about that empowerment and that kind of invoking that curiosity and that excitement about being an amputee or being somebody with limb difference. It's that actually it isn't, it doesn't have to be as hard as sometimes it might feel.
Well, that's fantastic. And I love the fact that it's not only about, somebody who wants to become a Paralympic athlete. For example, you gave the example of somebody who just wants to be able to do gardening to a certain level, or the more practical things that some of us take for granted, I guess, in everyday life. And if you become an amputee, those things might become more difficult. And I just think it's brilliant that you're trying to fill that sort of void with the charity. It's amazing. And also the thing is, you not only want to set up a charity, but you also spend some time speaking to people sort of in your own time on social media and stuff, don't you? You like to help, not only do you want to help with a charity, but also you want to help in your own time as well. If you could just talk to us a bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So like I say, we're on Instagram and Facebook. We're also on Reddit. And this started out through my process. When I was sharing my own story, I would get a lot of messages asking me about, various things that I was doing, or, how I would get messages from people who were just about to go into surgery. Or I would get messages from people who've had a limb disability all their life and were asking me for advice on how to cope with things, with, being a teenager or coming to next stages in their life and so on. I started to generate what was a lovely community of talking to people, and I met so many wonderful people, and this has just continued ever since. It's something I've never stopped doing, and it's something I feel really passionate about, because I know how difficult it can be. I know how dark those moments can be, and I've been in that scenario. So to when people ask me for advice, or will people speak to me and say, what's it really like? I'm really honest. I'm not going to kind of gloss over anything. I will tell the honest truth, and I'll tell my own honest story and say it was very difficult. But I'll also talk about the positives. And so I do that on Reddit and I do that on Instagram, but I also do it in real life. I was at my rehab clinic on Tuesday and spoke to a lovely lady while I was there who just recently had an amputation. And was in the kind of throes of first discovering what it's like to be an amputee, and spoke to her. So that support that comes from someone who's been there, or somebody who hasn't even been there, who's ongoing on that journey, can be exactly what you need. And it can also just be that thing of like, there is a future to this, that there is a life beyond that pain, or there is a life beyond limb disability or limb or amputation. And sometimes there are moments where you might not feel as though that is the case, and it absolutely is. There is nothing that you aren't capable of. Sometimes it is just the case of the right equipment or the right service or the right support, but sometimes actually you need to see it to believe it. And so I like to think that support is exactly what I'm there for, is to say it's possible and I can help you, or I can talk to you. And I'm not trained in anything. I'm by no means a counsellor. I can only share my own experience and my own journey. But I hope that it can help someone get through the darkest moments, because I think about the fact that I had access to a therapist and I had my family and friends, etc., who helped carry me through that. I think about those people out there who don't have that support network, who maybe haven't been spotted, and given access to a therapist, and are alone in it. And I don't know whether I would have got through it had I been alone in it. I don't know whether I would be here today. And I mean, what a shame that would have been. I would have gone all the way through fighting cancer and everything, only to have gone just because I didn't have the support network around me. And I hope to be that for somebody. And I have had some really sad messages, some really difficult messages that have brought up triggers in myself even. But it's something I feel really strongly about. I think that we should all be offering that to each other in society, let alone in groups of adversity like the limb disability group. And so it's crucial. I think it's the heart really for me of what Positive Bones is. It's the part that to a degree I enjoy the most.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's so inspirational, that you draw on your own personal experiences, knowing how hard it is, and that really motivates you to want to support and help others. And I love the point that you made about we could do with more of that in society in general, let alone in sort of adversity groups of mental health, limb difference, amputation. I think society does need more of that, people just looking out for each other. Everything is very often about conflict. So yeah, I think you make a very good point there. Josephine, the other thing I wanted to talk about are excuse me. The other thing I wanted to talk about are the various challenges that you've done, because you've done some quite interesting ones. You kayaked from Birmingham to Burton-on-Trent. You've done like one-legged skiing, I think. You've done skydiving. You've done various different things. And if you could just talk to us about that. And are they related to the charity? Is that like a form of fundraising? Can we expect more of those things? Yeah, if you could just talk to us a bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So it kind of started off, I had a lot of wonderful things done on my behalf when I was fundraising. So there was a Positive Bones ball where we raised £10,000, which was amazing. We had someone kayak all the way from the UK to France, which is absolutely incredible. We had tin bath races. We had someone BMX the entire TT lap. That was my dad. I mean, there was a whole spectrum of crazy challenges that people set themselves and tasks, and they were not only wonderful fundraising activities, but great motivators for me to see and kind of go, oh God, especially in those darkest days, to see that some people were taking themselves through these crazy tasks or these really difficult life challenges and pulling themselves through it acts always as a source of motivation and kind of like, wow, well, look what they've just done for me, which is really honoring. I mean, if anybody ever wants to eat humble pie and really truly understand what it's like, what compassion feels like, or how wonderful the world can be, I 100% recommend having an amputation and raising funds for a limb, because it is the best
what you need
way
to do.
To kind of, you see so much the power of the human spirit and of love and of caring. And anyway, back to my point. So I saw all these people doing these wonderful challenges, and I thought, well, I've got to do one too. Like, I can't not do
Got to
it,
muck in,
because that would be, that what kind of a fundraiser am I if I'm not taking part in the game? So I decided to do a kind of a pilgrimage to a degree. So I kayaked from Birmingham, which is where I live, all the way to Burton, which is where I bought my leg. And actually, the distance itself isn't really a challenge. It's 40 miles, which is long, but it's not, in kind of kayak terms, actually, it's not as big a challenge as it could have been. The challenge was actually that it was 50 locks. And every time I reached a lock, I had to get out the kayak, carry my kayak past the locks, and then get back into the water. And sometimes that would be 13 locks in a row. So I was carrying my kayak for like a mile. I was kayaking from 8 o'clock in the morning till 8 o'clock at night. And I did it on a Saturday. I did the whole distance in 2 days. So I started at 8 o'clock on a Saturday, finished at 8 o'clock on a Saturday evening, and then did the same thing again on the Sunday. And it was lovely because I told everybody about this on Positive Bones, and they all came, like people came and cheered me on from the sidelines and saw me go past, or met me at the pub. And also we would stop at pubs to have lunch, for example, and I would stand up on a table in the middle of the pub and say, right, I'm kayaking, look how wet I am, I'm kayaking from Birmingham to Burton-on-Trent to buy myself a leg, I'm an amputee, and I would tell my story from a miniature soapbox in the middle of pubs and stuff like that to get people to fundraise and to go onto the Instagram page and so on. And so that was my kind of epic challenge that I did for an official fundraiser. But I also, in that first year of being an amputee, really challenged myself physically because I wanted to see what my leg was capable of. So I learned to ski one-legged, and I skydived, and I hiked, and then that's really continued. So I aim now to do a challenge every year. And this year, my sister is currently climbing. Well, she's attempting to hike all of the Wainwrights. So there's 214 Wainwright peaks in the Lake District, and she's aiming to hike all of them. And I have decided I'm going to join her on probably the hardest one, which is Scarfell. So we're going to hike that together for Positive Bones, and that will be then now to raise money for the charity, which is great. So I've obviously done this fundraising for Positive Bones, the fundraiser, and now I'm going to be doing it for Positive Bones, the charity, which is going to be quite emotional, I think, to be honest. I mean, I was extremely emotional when I did my kayak, and when I finished it, because I didn't really expect to ever have got there. But yeah, it's going to be really emotional to come to the top of that and know that it's now for something that's going to help someone else, because that's always what I wanted to do with this, really. So yeah, so I have set myself all sorts of crazy challenges, and I continue to want to do so. I got this leg for a reason, and that's to be able to not say no to things. And so if people have got suggestions, I'll definitely be there going, yeah, I'll give that a go. I'll see what that's like.
Well, that's fantastic. This is also inspirational, and yeah, I think I would encourage people to go and follow Positive Bones on Instagram and other social media channels. I'll put all the links in the description, and if you want to suggest some challenges for Josephine to do, please do. Let's get some suggestions in. But most importantly, just go and follow, support, and keep up to date with everything that's going on with the charity, and obviously take any opportunities to donate as and when they come up. Josephine, it's been so inspirational to talk to you. Your story is incredible. You've had to overcome so much over such an extended period of time, and you talk about it all with such a sort of positivity, and we spoke earlier about sort of your ability to sort of process things and deal with them. It's just incredible. And I think there'll be a lot of people listening who are going through their own things. It might not be amputation, it might not be cancer, it might not be any of those things, but I think they can take something from your story of resilience. And one way I like to finish off the podcast, I do them all in the same way, is by asking guests to give listeners a few bits of advice, should they find themselves going through difficult situations. And as I say, that doesn't have to be specific to sort of the things that you've gone through yourself. It can just be general, or you can take it down a specific route for people who might be going through the sort of amputation journey. I'll leave that up to you, Josephine. But yeah, are there any sort of final points that you'd like to give for listeners?
The point, actually, I offer a lot, and this is for, as part of my job as being a lecturer, there is a degree of pastoral care, and it's something I think I've said to the students so often. is to be kind to yourself. We hear it as a cliche term, but actually it's really true, to give yourself that space to go, do you know what? It's okay. It's okay that I'm feeling rough today. It's okay that I want to wallow. It's okay that I'm not coping with this. Like those things that actually, for me, admitting that I had depression was the hardest part, but it was when things started to get better. And had, I would have ended up just continuing to spiral had I not just accepted that I was struggling. And so first of all, it's that compassion. Think about yourself. If you were talking to a friend and they were telling you how you were feeling, what would you say to them, and what guidance would you give them? What support would you give them? And talk to yourself in that same way. Like, talk to yourself as someone you love, because you are someone you love. Life is really, really precious, and it's short and fleeting and wonderful, and there's so much opportunity. And so we have to love ourselves and learn how to love ourselves. So the other thing is to not compare yourself to others. I think so often in recovery, we can kind of get into this habit of going, well, they've had all sorts of terrible stuff happen in their life, and they've got back from it and they've bounced back, and why can't I? And actually that's completely false, because first of all, it's a matter of it's very subjective. And I talk about this sometimes when people often say to me, and it actually irritates me in a horrible way, they'll go, of course it's nothing compared to what you've been through. And I'm like, well, that doesn't matter, because my experiences have meant that I am this person. But for example, if you're someone who's never experienced pain in their life, they've never so much as stubbed a toe, and if you had a paper cut for the first, and that would be excruciating, because it'd be the first pain you've ever experienced. And so often our life and the things we go through are magnified by all the things that have happened before. And if everything's been relatively peaceful and then you're thrown into a pit, it will suddenly feel like the darkest thing in the world. So it's very much down to individual experience, how you take things and how difficult things are for you. And so this idea of comparing ourselves to someone's other life is mad, really, because theirs is exactly that. It's a whole other life with everything else going on behind it, and everything that's led up to it, and everything that's coming through the other side of it. So I think that comparison often, particularly in regards to recovery, can be such an enemy to our own recovery, because we can end up chastising ourselves so much. And then finally, it's to reach out. Sometimes we can really feel like we're alone, and just because we might not have there are lots of wonderful support mechanisms and charities and things like that out there. So even if you feel alone in regards to your social circle, or even if you feel uncomfortable about talking to people within your social circle, it doesn't mean that there isn't someone out there willing to listen. And search for it. We all have access to Google these days, so reach out to those charity networks out there, to those support networks out there, those helplines, because you aren't alone, and you shouldn't ever feel alone, and there is someone always willing to help you out and to listen to you in some format, and it's just about finding them. And you shouldn't have to suffer alone, really, either. And ultimately, what's going to get you through sometimes some of the darkest times is that group effort, or is knowing that there's people around you. So those are my 3 top tips.
Well, I think they're fantastic, and yeah, I felt almost quite moved listening to some of them, actually. And that point that you made about there isn't a scale of how you should feel based on what you're going through, and if someone else is higher up on that scale, then they have more right to feel more shit than you do. Essentially, that's not how it works. Everything is individual, and it does come down a lot of the time to what you've experienced before, as you rightly say. So yeah, absolutely, people shouldn't underplay their own suffering. Everything can be extremely difficult in its own way, and also, yeah, absolutely, I agree with what you're saying. If people do reach a point where things are sort of getting out of control and getting really dark, there is support beyond your family and network of friends. There's loads of things online nowadays, because we've got fantastic people like you setting up things like Positive Bones, for example, and similar things exist for mental health and other illnesses. So there is support out there. You just have to, as you say, have a look on Google and try and find it. Josephine, it's been a privilege to sit here and hear all of your story and talk about it in detail, and also hear all about Positive Bones, the charity, and all of the things that it hopes to achieve in the future. As I said before, I really encourage everyone to go and follow and participate in everything you guys are doing. So yeah, as a parting note, I just want to say thank you so much for coming on. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed it, and I think it's fantastic what you're doing. I think the podcast is great. So thanks.
That's it for today's today's episode, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please give it a like and hit subscribe. It really helps the channel out, and also that way it makes sure that you never miss an episode. If you've got a story you want to share on the Back on Track podcast, get in touch, give me a shout. I'd love to hear from you via info@backontrackpodcast.com.